All right, hey everybody, SuboneKD here. I am doing something a little different for me. I'm going to actually do a react and kind of virtual review of a new controller coming out. Just landed this morning, Iceman Isaac. If you are unfamiliar with this gentleman, he is a fantastic player. He is a streamer, a YouTuber, and just a terrific asset to the community. He is sponsored by Scuff, and he is actually going to be unveiling the new Scuff controller. And I saw it this morning. I watched this video and had some thoughts on the controller just from a fundamental level. So what I want to do is roll the tape. I want to watch along with you some of the important parts. And from there, I want to then break it down, break down the controller, what we know about it, kind of some of the features that I think are really good, some of the features that I think are more gimmicky, and kind of where it's going to sit in terms of, you know, the stack of controllers that are out there right now. There's quite a few. Some are better than others, and yeah. So I want to make sure that that gets that we take a good look at this controller. Just disclaimer: I am affiliated with AIM controllers. I do have a code for that, code sub1. But I don't want that. I want to get that out in the open so that it's clear that when I look at this, I'm looking at it in terms of like the usability of a controller, and I'm going to try and separate my thoughts in terms of what a pro player and like a player at Iceman's level will use and need versus like an average or below average player who's simply looking to kind of step up their play, and they're either, you know, looking to improve their abilities, or, you know, maybe, you know, you're above average player looking to take it to the next level. You know, is this controller going to help you in that? So that's my goal. That's what I'm looking at. So let's go ahead and roll some tape, find out a little bit about this controller, and then let's break it down.
A moment of gameplay. Well, I ended up investing in my gameplay and I got myself a Scuff. It has the paddles on the back of the controller, so that way you could, you know, remap your face buttons like jumping and crouching to the paddles, so that way you're always aiming, always moving. Well,
paddles on the
custom
back.
controllers
changes the game.
They've been expensive for a long time, and frankly, there hasn't been a whole lot of innovation. And even more frankly, Scuffs, they had some early reliability issues, right?
I've heard that.
Whether it was stick drift or the paddles were a little bit flexible, a lot of people had issues with their early Scuffs. Well,
now, look, I want to point this out. This is something that I've heard repeatedly. It's one of the reasons that I never invested in a Scuff up front for testing purposes or for playability, is because most people I talk to, they had bad experiences with it, and they had even worse experiences with Scuff's returns and warranty. So, so these are things that I've heard. So I don't disagree with him. I'm glad that he's bringing that up.
They ended up getting a merger with Corsair, a PC peripheral company well known for extreme quality control, and they ended up dropping what is the Reflex, the PlayStation 5 Reflex. It's been my weapon of choice. It's got the mouse click trigger.
All right. Looks like, is it 4 paddles on the back, which I think is necessary. I want to talk about the alignment of where those paddles are located on the back of the controller, because I think that makes a difference for a lot of people. So I'm going to be curious about how the playability of this would be. I think it's going to be similar to some other Scuff controllers that have this sort of configuration, and I've used this configuration on other branded controllers before. I'll share some thoughts on that in a bit.
For the rapid fire shots, it's got really stable paddles, USB-C with a crazy low input delay. It's been my main controller. But there has been one thing, it doesn't matter, Battle Beaver, Scuff, whatever it may be, Xbox Series Elite, there has been one thing holding back controller players for so long until now.
Good tunes. Good groove. I like the RBG on the front. It's classy. Classy. Programmable G keys. Okay. I want to look at, so this is something that came up. I'm going to go into this a little bit more, but I want you to take a look at where they have these extra programmable buttons. There's side buttons right on the edge of that controller. I think that's going to be important long term. But I think it's something that should be looked at a little bit with a little bit more of a critical eye because of the placement. But let's hear more about it, and we'll go back to those.
Introducing the Scuff Envision controller, and you saw a few features there in that teaser, but
I wonder if that's a
even
touch bar
begin
at the
to
top,
tap
something
on what is
that
the true game changer about
like the
this
PlayStation
controller.
has.
Now, who the heck
So
am
it's
I to
like
be telling you
be
about a
compatible
controller?
for both
Well,
kind of
if you
games.
don't know, my name is Isaac, or Iceman Isaac. I'm an ex-Air Force pilot turned full-time video game creator
You're
who's
good.
done everything from
get into
game
this
guides and
controller a bit.
gameplay on Overwatch to Blackout to Fortnite,
Skip forward a little
competing
bit.
in tournaments, and I know this controller inside and out better than anyone on the planet, including probably the people at Scuff. And I'm going to give you a full breakdown about what I love,
Good.
what I don't like, and what you should consider before buying this controller. Now, full disclosure, if you do end up going forward with your purchase decision, you can use code Isaac for a discount. But once again, if this is not the right controller for you, I will let you know. So how are we going to break down this video? Well, first and foremost, I'm going to go over real quick all of the essentials of this controller. Then the most important part, I am going to cover what makes this a competitive advantage, a true game changer. And then most importantly, I'm going to talk about any concerns and any considerations that you should have heading into a purchase decision for the new Scuff Envision. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. So this is your first look at the Scuff Envision controller. And at first glance, it looks like a lot of other controllers, but then you start to notice a few things special about it. Let's go ahead and start with the basics. It has a double centered thumbstick design, which is what I personally prefer. It has a D-pad off to the side, controller buttons off to the side, pretty standard stuff, a start button and an options button. It has a power button here because this can be operated wirelessly, and it also has a profile switcher here. So if you ever have any mappings on this, you can switch up profiles for different games, or maybe you have a family member who uses a different profile. It all works just through that. But what are these buttons down on the bottom? Now, as you can see from the graphic here, they are RGB addressable. I don't currently have the controller plugged in, but fortunately, this controller does work wirelessly, as we mentioned earlier, and you can see they light up. Ever been in the middle of a game and you wanted to mute the game, or maybe mute proximity chat because it was getting a little toxic, or maybe you wanted to pause your music, or maybe you're a streamer and you want to switch a scene or mute on Discord? Everything can be done through the G keys. We'll talk more about the software that allows that to happen. As we rotate the controller to the side, you will see the side buttons are back. All of my OG Vantage 2 friends, the side action buttons are back. So if you want to ping someone while you're shooting them, you can do that. If you want to use it for a push to talk, those are also custom addressable as well. The triggers have been completely redesigned. Check this out. So right now they are set to instant triggers, where they feel like mouse clicks, extremely rapid fire. Well, let's say I want to use this and go play.
Instant triggers are, I mean, that's, to me, that is probably the most important part of any aftermarket, like higher end controller. If you're buying anything other than a replacement baseline controller, the triggers are going to be the most important aspect of it. So if they aren't mouse click, you need to rethink it. So a lot of controllers will do, they'll do the elite style trigger stop, where they basically will have a piece of plastic that will insert below the trigger and limit how far it can move, and that sets a software preset on the controller that lets you have a shorter trigger pull, which is terrific, right? So for first-person shooters, that's what you want. You want the shortest trigger pull and the fastest response possible. The issue with trigger stops is it still has a lot of movement, right? The actual trigger itself actually has to move a far distance to actuate and return. And the reason that's important is it actually slows down your ability to fire repeatedly. And so in first-person shooters, Call of Duty in particular, you drop in, you have a pistol, right? The difference in trigger can be the difference between winning and losing the gunfight, because you can simply fire it faster on a aftermarket controller than you can on a basic controller, because the trigger has to, the trigger is not just moving a shorter distance, but it's actually more responsive. So it moves a little bit, stops and rebounds and resets itself faster than on a trigger stop, in which case it still moves a decent amount. So I'll give you an example here. This is the Razor, and it has the stops, right? So I can click that, and this trigger will have a full range of motion. Okay. Now, if I put the stop in place, it is much less in terms of range of motion, but it is still moving quite a bit. You can see there's a lot of movement there, versus if I pull up, this is the aim controller, right? So my most recent controller, these have the mouse click triggers, and you can see it moves almost, I'm pushing it. I don't know if you can see that in the camera, how little this moves, but you can hear it clicking. Okay. So that controller is going to be able to fire faster. You're going to be able to actuate it quicker and reset it much quicker than even a trigger stop controller. So getting to that mouse click proficiency mouse click efficiency is critical on a controller. I think it's a deciding factor. It should be a deciding factor when you buy a controller.
Play a racing game. I want to go play some Forza or something.
Unless you play Forza.
Check this out. Now they are fully articulating triggers. This controller can be used for story mode, RPG, and then instantly be swapped back over just with your fingernail over to FPS mode, and boom, rapid fire is back. As you can see there, that is the option to switch from a USB to a wireless mode. I personally like the game always with wired for the lowest input delay. As you can see here, this has the strongest paddles, in my opinion, ever made out of a Scuff controller. Okay, this is taking design inspiration from the Instinct. I kind of alluded to it earlier. The Instinct is the next-gen Xbox controller. I have been using the U-Reflex, and it has the same wicked strong, like, you cannot break these paddles no matter how hard you squeeze them.
I promise I will.
How they're built. Whereas the Reflex,
I've done it before.
I love it. But even the Reflex, you can bend those paddles in the opposite direction if you want and maybe squeeze them and pull them side to side. The Envision, they're not going anywhere.
Well,
rock solid. On top of that, you have a USB-C port embedded in there. Rock solid. You're never going to have to worry about that port coming.
This is, to me, another distinction between paddles and buttons. And I think that I don't know if I'd even qualify these as paddles. These look more like buttons. And that, to me, is a plus. That's a huge plus. You want buttons. Paddles, just like your trigger, paddles tend to have a lot of movement to them. They take a lot of effort to actuate. And depending on how aggressive you are with your paddles and what you're trying to do, I've actually had paddles pop off, on the rebound. They've popped off of, the Elite 2, for example, because of the way that they're hinged in there. So moving away from paddles to actually hard buttons is, I think, is a positive. It's a big plus for this controller over previous Scuffs.
Coming loose in the middle. This is a strong feeling controller in the hand. And to kick it off, right below there, you can see it also has a port for a microphone, and you can also, as you'd expect, mute that microphone using those G keys. On top of that, you can also remove this faceplate if you want to change up designs, whether you're just feeling a little different that day, or maybe you share it with a family member. You can change up designs by simply lifting off the magnetic faceplate. That also makes it nice if you ever want to replace your thumbsticks. If you want a fresh, tackier feeling thumbstick, or if you want to change from concave to domed, you can do that all as well.
So it seems like the entire thumbstick mechanism does replace, probably on top of the actuator. You're probably not pulling the entire unit out to switch these out, which is, I think, a plus in the design, especially if they're easy to access, because if it's just the thumbsticks, like the top of the stick, I feel like and this is one critique I have of an aim controller, is you get some wear, and it's a little limiting on how low, for example, you can make one of the sticks compared to some of the other controllers I've played with. But yeah, it's a good feature.
Inside, they do have rumble packs, but it is a very lightweight feeling controller. A lot of like the OG PS5, Xbox controllers, when they have the rumble packs in, it feels really heavy. It doesn't feel heavy with rumble packs in, and you can turn off the rumble using the integrated IQ software. Now, the Envision comes in two separate models. We've been taking a look at the Scuff Envision Pro. It comes in both steel gray, and it also comes in this white. Now, eventually, Scuff will come out with what we know and love, which is the customizable custom controllers where you can choose every individual. So for me, that would be a deal breaker. But for most of you, the deal breaker is going to be the price. How much is this?
$179.
I know it's a lot. With digital buttons, with the G keys, with the side action buttons, with the remappable paddles, and the feature.
Let's see.
Proprietary design for PC, they save out on all that money, and they pass the savings back to the consumer.
What he's saying is, it's basically freaking cool. It's designed for PC only. It's not Xbox or PlayStation, so it doesn't.
You've been gassing something up for a while. Why don't you just freaking get to it?
No big deal.
Let's go ahead and get into part 2 of this video.
So if you're on Xbox or PlayStation,
what makes this controller
this one is
so groundbreaking, and more importantly, what is that dang competitive advantage? Let's check it out. So we're here inside the Corsair IQ software. And as you can see, when we plug in the Envision Pro, it shows up and we have a lot of different things we can do here. As you see, we can adjust the lighting effects for the controller. It can be solid, it can be static, it can be rainbow, whatever you want. For the triggers, you can adjust your dead zone for the triggers, and you have a constant live feed of
This
both.
is something you can do on the Xbox,
looks like with the
on the Xbox Elite 2 as
trigger,
well.
but then we go over to
so
the
you can
digital
go in
side,
and you can do it.
and then
And
look at what it looks
in
like.
Call of Duty
Instant.
in particular,
Right, so now
you can actually have it
how
be.
it reflects
You can
inside
do
of the
this.
software.
You can
Let's
do
say
this
you can change your
in
trigger
Call of
response
Duty
curve,
as
you
well.
can
If you
change your
didn't know
dead
that,
zones, all of
you
that
can
is
adjust the
available
dead
here in the
zone
software.
on your trigger so
Exact
that
same thing
the
is gonna
minute
be
you
done
touch
over on
it,
the
it
thumbstick side.
actuates.
If you ever need to change
And so
your
then it's about
thumbstick,
the physical
you can change the
return
dead
and
zone here.
reset.
And let's say a game doesn't have a dynamic
on the follow-up
response
shot.
curve like
That's why
Warzone.
the mouse click
You can
becomes
change
important.
to a dynamic response curve.
Again,
now I would keep everything
curves,
linear. I would keep
and stuff.
all your dead zones
A lot
to
of this
zero,
you're
and
gonna
then
mess
change
around
those
with.
in game. But
Exactly.
in the event that you do need to change it for a game that does not have these settings, this is where I would do
statement,
it.
but
By
generally
default, just keep it default.
leave it
keep
linear, leave it
keep your
default.
Dead zones low.
I
and
had
then
this
change
problem
it in
with
your
the
game
Elite
if
2
your game
messing around
supports
with
it.
it
Like I mentioned earlier,
in
you can
software.
also turn your vibration all the way down, which is what I personally do.
So I've had this before when I mess around with the Elite 2. When I would ran that, I would mess around with the stuff in the software on the Xbox, and then I would go and play in game, and I would mess around with it in game because it was a different setup. And unfortunately, you would get some really weird conflicts where it would be an inconsistent movement because it was a linear response in the controller and then an additional linear adjustment in the game itself. And so you could create some kind of weird scenarios depending on how extreme you went. And so that it took me a while to figure out that it's one or the other, and it's better to do it in game, in my opinion, because the game knows what it wants. It knows what it's looking for. So if you set it in game, the game is going to respond the way it's designed to. If you set it on your controller software, it may not send the signals to the game in the way that the game is looking for, and you can create some weird inconsistencies, I would say. I mean, it's not going to break your game, but it could be that you can't turn fast enough, or the sticks just don't seem as responsive as they could, or they're too responsive, right? You can go either way. So it's good to have this kind of software. I don't think that most people will need to use it.
You can update your firmware here and your brightness, etc. But this is where it all changes. So
here's the part that's important. Now, because this is a PC design controller, it's not bound to interact with the PlayStation or the Xbox interfaces, so you have more leeway in it. You also have a series of extra buttons. So you can see on the back here, the yellow are unmapped buttons. I imagine that you can map just about everything on this kind of controller. You could probably drive a submarine with it if you wanted, and would have a better chance than somebody else who did that with an Amazon Logitech. But with all of these features, here's the thing that I'm going to point out: when you have more buttons on a controller, the more buttons you add, especially if they're not in an intuitive position. So you look, I'm going to specifically call out the G keys, but I'm going to talk about the side buttons in a minute. But the more buttons you have, the less likely it is that in the heat of the moment when you need those buttons, that you're going to remember what they all do and where they all are. So this was an issue that I had. So I ran for a long time. I ran the Razer Chroma V2. All right. And so this also had, so it had 4 buttons on the back, and then it had an additional set of mappable buttons on top. So very similar to the Scuff, where it has the side buttons, right? But instead of being on the side, they're up here on the top. So the idea is, if you were holding the controller, right, I can be on the trigger, and then I can have this other, these other features here. So here's the problem, and this is something also with paddles on the back. If you've gone from no paddles to paddles, it's going to create the same kind of issue of your brain has to remember where features are, right? You have to remember that A, you have the ability to use a paddle on the back, and that will do something, and B, you have to train your brain to recognize it when you aren't thinking about it. So if you're just standing, camping in the corner of a room, and you're like, oh, I want to pull up the tack map, and I happen to have that button mapped to, one of these shoulder buttons, well, that's great. But if I'm in the middle of a gunfight and I don't remember, for some reason I need to pull up my tack map, the odds that I will sit there and on the fly hit it and do what I need to do. So tac map's a bad example. The action button, the X button on PlayStation or on Xbox to pick stuff up off the ground. I had that mapped to one of these buttons for a while, and the stupid camera tracking is driving me nuts. But I would never use it because in the heat of the moment, if I am not under pressure, I would simply use the button on, the face button. But if I'm under pressure, I'm not in the mindset to think about, okay, hold on, I want to pick up this ammo as I run by it. What button is that? Oh yeah, it's a shoulder button. Let me adjust my grip to make sure I can actuate it properly. It just doesn't happen in the middle of a gunfight. So extra buttons can be great. I think that you start running into the limit of what is useful versus what is more gimmicky, and then you add these extra buttons down on the side here, the G buttons. And I think this is where this controller starts to go, has a lot of great assets and a lot of great features, and it starts to lean into more of the gimmick. I think the problem with having so many buttons down there, and he goes into examples of like, oh, I can ping, and I can mute my chat, and I can do all these other things. Well, that's great, but these buttons aren't in a great spot for a quick action, and so in the time it takes you to stop and look down and figure out what button you want to push, the odds are you can, either use a foot pedal or you can hit your space bar or whatever you have mapped to you're on PC, whatever you have mapped to your existing keyboard. Like, you can set it up so that that's equally as efficient in a lot of ways. So I think what most people will do is end up not using those G keys for anything useful pretty much at all, right? You're not going to likely put it into an action button. You're not going to likely put it into into some function in the game where you need to hit a specific little key on the fly. What you're going to do is use, somebody like Iceman, who streams, who has more than just the game going on. He needs more control over elements that, the average player probably won't. I think this controller makes a lot of sense. So, the ability to like mute chat or mute the game. He goes into a segment where he mutes the game audio, which is great if you want to talk to chat, or if somebody in prox chat or in the lobby is mouthing off and you don't want to have that going through, your stream. Then having those controls easy access makes a lot of sense. It really does. But if you're just Joe Schmo who wants to play the game, I don't think you will use them in most scenarios. You might set them up and map them to things, and you might on occasion use them. But I don't think that you're going to really get the use out of them that would kind of justify calling it a must-have feature. So on this particular controller, I think this is where you get into that gimmick side of things. The other section the other element that I want to talk about is those side buttons, right? So I mentioned, the Razer had them. I didn't use them as much, but I want to look at where they are. Let's see if we can show better where those buttons are. You can, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to this area. Come on. Play.
Down on the bottom. Now, as you can see from the graphic here, they are RGB addressable. I don't currently have the controller plugged in, but fortunately, this...
Oh, I almost had it. I had a good... Oh, here we go. There we go. All right. So look at where those buttons are in relation to how you're going to hold the controller. It's going to put them... So if I'm holding the controller, I'm going to try and reverse it here. If I'm holding the controller, right, the buttons are going to be right in here, all right? Which, in terms of actually using the buttons, compared to the Razer's placement, which is up in this area, which, this controller is physically larger. So I'll compare it to an Xbox controller. It's physically a larger controller. You can see I have it kind of lined up well. You can just see it's spread out farther. The stick distances are more. It physically has thicker hand controls. So this is a larger controller. And with the spacing on the back paddles, it's hard to explain without feeling it. But if you don't have large hands, it's not going to be a great controller for you. But even with, bigger hands, the way that you're expected to hold this thing to actually make use of everything is a little uncomfortable. And honestly, I found the ergonomics of it didn't really lend itself to success long term. It had a lot of great features for when I acquired it, but I think the more that I've used it and the more that I've used other controllers that meet more of a standard form factor, I think it's a little off kilter and a little bit of a miss. But it's something you can get used to and adapt to. But going back to the trigger, the side buttons. So I talked about not using these side buttons very often because of their location. But given the controller itself and the way that you would hold so I'll use my aim controller. In order to actuate it, I'm not able to grip down here, right? I'm not able to hold this in a grip, so I actually have to put pressure sideways to hold it with the palms of my hand over, say a traditional controller where I can actually hold it. I'm holding it with my fingers, right? I can hold it one hand and I can still hold the controller. Properly holding one of these, I'm not holding it very well. Like I need my thumb to balance it because I'm not using my fingers to grip it because I've got these, I've got paddles on the back. So if I grip it, I'm actuating the paddles. I don't want that normally. So it's a two-handed grip controller, which is fine for 99% of gameplay. But it means that I'm putting pressure inward with my hands, with the palms of my hands. The pressure is going inward, which means I'm naturally going to be putting pressure on or near those buttons. And I feel like it's going to do two things. One is it runs the risk of accidentally actuating the side buttons, which if they're set to something like ping, it's not a big deal. But if you have it set to like reload, for example, you're going to be reloading your gun a lot more frequently than you would expect. I can think of some other ways you could map it that would make sense, but also if you accidentally trigger it, it's a problem. And then the other aspect is it's going to change the way that you grip it. So right now, I grip this controller and I'm letting my finger rest naturally here so that the only thing I have to move is the end of my finger, right? I'm not having to hold my fingers out of the way. I don't have to hold it unnaturally. I can hold this controller comfortably in my hands, right? Same with the standard one. My fingers, they can rest here, and I only have to worry about whether I can move it at the joint, right? So it's just, that's all that's moving. But if I have buttons right in here, I can't see it. If I have buttons here, and I've got my hand there, now I have to keep my fingers up and off, which for some people it won't be a huge issue, but for other people that, depending on how your natural grip tendency is, the odds are you're going to be uncomfortable holding it, and over a longer period of time, you're actually going to get your hands will get sore faster. Like you're not going to be as efficient over time because you've got a lot of strain in your fingers holding them up off of those side buttons. So I don't think that the side buttons are bad per se, but I do worry that for most people, it's going to be in the way more than it is effective, right? So it's not going to add as much of a benefit as it creates risk and or uncomfortability over a longer play session. So for a lot of people, I don't think that's a bad thing. If they get used to it, they get used to it. If not, they don't use the buttons. But the G buttons, the strip of buttons at the bottom, I think is definitely a gimmick. That to me isn't a selling point and isn't something that I think most people will use. So when it comes to actually, justifying the cost of this controller, those buttons kind of are a selling point that Scuff is going to push. But I think at the end of the day, when you really dig into it, for most people, they aren't going to get a benefit out of them. So, I kind of chalk those up as a gimmick. They're kind of harmless at the same time. They're not in the way. I think the side buttons to me are a turnoff. I think the frustration of accidentally pinging or throwing a grenade or whatever it is I have mapped to those is going to make me less inclined to use them over a situation where I have maybe some kind of third paddle on the back. Last thing is I want to talk about the position of those triggers on the back. So they're kind of where this, so they're kind of in here, right? Along the, where I have these paddles on this controller, there's one here and then there's one here. So when you're gripping it, you're going to use one finger to hit both paddles, right? Either in or out, okay? And so what you can see is I would push it in or I would push it in. So I'm either pushing this way or I'm pushing this way to actuate those buttons, which versus a control like this where they're stacked on top of each other. And so I wrap my fingers. I'm actually going to use my middle finger and my ring finger are going to be the ones on that sit on these keys and actuate the buttons. All right. It does require a little practice to use them this way, but it opens up combinations that are otherwise not really readily available in a single button or single finger actuated situation. So I've used that configuration on, I want to say it was a Power A controller. I don't believe it was the Fusion Pro. I would have to go back and check to see. But I've used that configuration before, and what I found is it was good for having them for the availability of the buttons, but in terms of actually being able to use them in combination. So, for example, to slide cancel on Modern Warfare 2019 Warzone 1, it was a 2-button combination. And so you could on a controller like this, right? You could jump, slide, and I could alternate between the two. So I could go slide, slide, jump, slide, slide, jump, to pull off the effective slide cancel. But if they were mapped, into one corner, that's a more difficult scenario, and it requires me to actually adjust my grip on it to hit both in cadence with each other, or I have to map them to other sides of the paddle, so I'm using opposite fingers. So I don't think that that's my favorite design. I don't love that design. I think other people might, depending on what your use case is. But I think having 4 separate buttons that are usable on 4 separate fingers is the more advantageous way of doing it. So, and that's comparable to the Elite. It's comparable to the Razer. It's comparable to the AIM controller. Battle Beaver, I think, does it that way. I'd have to double check with them. But most places, Power A does it with 4 separate buttons, 4 separate fingers. So I think from that standpoint, I don't know how well it's going to be looked at and how usable it's going to be long term for the average player. Now, someone like Iceman, who they have a stream to manage, they don't always want to take their hand off to hit a button. They don't maybe want to always have to keep the foot pedals up and running. If you want to keep all of your control for your stream and your chat and your control, your gameplay all in one controller, I think there's a huge window of opportunity with this one. And if your goal is to just kind of step up your play from a standard controller, I think it's, for a lot of people, it will provide a lot of assets that they're not going to use. Long term, it's also not controller compatible or console compatible, so I'd be a little concerned about that. But as far as the aesthetics, as far as a lot of the features, I think it's got a lot of key features. It doesn't seem to have any major misses. So I think it's a good controller. I think for the price at a basic controller at $180, $179, I think it's right in there. I think the addition of Bluetooth and wireless compatibility is a huge plus. So you could sync this, obviously with your phone if you want to play Warzone Mobile. You can sync it with your PC if you want to sit back a little bit. So yeah, it's got a lot of pluses, a lot of good features. I don't have a huge long list of negatives. I kind of, there's a little bit of personal preference in some of the things I pointed out, but I mean, in my mind, I think they're concerns that, some people will have. At that $180 mark, you're at a base aim controller. You are at the Elite 2, which has some features this doesn't, and it's also missing some features that this has. So there's some pros and cons that you can weigh back and forth. It has, you know, the aim controller. You know, the Razer is a little bit cheaper, but again has some negatives to it in terms of ergonomics. So depending on what you're looking for, you know, that option exists. Yeah, no, I think it's going to be a good controller. I think people are going to like it. You know, if you like Scuff, it's probably going to be something to look for. If you're a PC player, if you're not a PC player, this one's going to be off the table for you, I believe. Somebody correct me in the comments down below if that is not the case, if this is compatible across platform, but I don't believe that it will be. So yeah, that's my review. Those are my thoughts. You know, watching the video, thinking about the controller, want to do a reaction. Let me know down in the comments how you think this went. If you think this is the kind of content you want to see from me going forward, love to do more of this. Love to just kind of talk about this. You know, these tech innovations, new controllers, some of the stuff as it comes out in more of a informal manner. But yeah, so thanks Iceman for putting the video together. Thanks for airing it out. Thanks for showing it, Scuff. Excellent job. Let's start getting in the wild and getting our hands and see how we play with it. All right, I've been SuboneKD. Thanks for coming by. I'll catch you guys later.